G'day, I've been your imaginary underworld apostate, not Jar Witness, and you're watching Atheist Edge.
Was Jesus a man of peace? Do not think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be all the members of his household. Matthew 10:34-36. And he said to them, But now let him who has a purse take it along, likewise also a bag, and let him who has no sword sell his robe and buy one. Luke 12:36. Do you suppose that I came to grant peace on earth? I tell you no, but rather division. For from now on 5 members in one household will be divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. Luke 12:51-52. But those mine enemies who do not want me to rule over them, bring them here and slay them before me. Luke 19:27. Jesus is speaking in parables in this verse, but let there be no doubt, his threat is explicit.
His first statement is about the Jews being God's chosen people. Even they have questioned this. David Ben-Gurion sent archaeologists out. Bless their little scientific hearts, they at least were honest. There was no evidence, and now we know through the Genome Project and that they were never enslaved in Egypt. And anyway, they ran, the short way to Canaan and stuff, so it didn't even make sense. But as far as being God's chosen people, Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof at one point said, I know we're the chosen people, but for once in a while, couldn't you choose somebody else? I mean, that was pretty arrogant, I think, but I think it really was just a matter of a Canaanite clan wanting to be different than all the ones surrounding them, so they made up their own mythos. And in fact, there was an earlier story where there's a high god, and Yahweh is one of the sons of God, like the Nephilim or whatever. I think were their children with human women, but they make up less than 2% of the population now, so they certainly aren't being chosen very much now, and have had conquering, but everybody's been conquered or been the conquerors. They've, in the Bible they did conquering, but in real life I don't think they did much. They have been conquered. And in fact, I was told by my grandmother said that the Jews actually started using the maternal line because even in ancient Roman times, because of rape, they would be raped out of existence. So they decided if a child was born of a Jewish mother, it was Jewish, and they raised it as such. And so I don't think that makes you very God-chosen or God-preferred. And if so, boy, I wouldn't want to be one of them. And I've got Jewish blood in me, or Hebrew blood in me, supposedly.
Scientific evidence for evolution, unity of life, nested hierarchies, convergence of independent phylogenies, transitional species, chronological of common ancestors, anatomical molecular vestiges and atavisms, ontology and developmental biology, past and present biographies, anatomical and molecular pheromology and convergence, anatomical and subatomical function, protein and DNA function redundancy, transposons, redundant facedogenes, endogenous retroviruses, genetic, morphological and functional change, expectations, morphological rates, genetic rates, scientific evidence for the biblical creation.
absurd, discriminatory, and vacuous religious-based laws against women. In Yemen, as in many Islamic countries, a woman is only considered half a witness in court. Also, women are not allowed to leave the house without their husband's permission. This is still true as far as I know. There's a lot of, being a woman in a lot of these countries is not fantastic. And religion has a lot to do with it. Although it's difficult to dissect the way what is the culture and what is the religion, because religion is often a function of culture, and sometimes religion reinforces culture. But anyway, I'll read through the rest of these points that Jim makes, and I'll just comment on whether they're still relevant today. So, in addition to the point about Yemen, abortion is illegal in Ecuador unless you are mentally ill. This is still the case. It is illegal in Ecuador unless... So the woman must be mentally ill, and her legal representation, whoever's in charge of her, has to also consent to the abortion. And the pregnancy also has to be the result of some sort of a sexual crime. So she would have had to been raped or something like that. Most South American countries have similar kinds of laws. So if you look at the state of abortion laws around the world, North America, Europe, and Asia, most places in northern latitudes, weirdly enough, seem to have pretty permissive abortion laws where it's legal whenever the woman decides that it's time for an abortion, that it's legal. In South America, as well as in Africa, as well as in more sort of southeastern Asia, I would say, mostly Muslim-influenced countries, there's a lot of restrictions. So either abortion is outright illegal in all cases, or it's heavily restricted, as is the case in Ecuador. So not super fantastic there for women. Women may not operate a motor vehicle in Saudi Arabia. This one has actually been recently withdrawn, I think within the past couple of years, although Saudi Arabia is still not super happy about the activists that brought this about and helped bring this about. And just the other day, one of the leading activists was in prison. So it is the case now that things are improving a bit for women in Saudi Arabia, but they still got a ways to go. Rape victims can be thrown in prison in Afghanistan, Ireland, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, and India. So this, I wasn't able to verify any of this, that rape victims can be thrown in prison. It may be the case in Afghanistan or Somalia, where it's suspected that the rape is not actually rape. Maybe they just don't believe the rape victim. But in places like Ireland, Ireland certainly does not have this law where if you're a rape victim. Maybe at one point in the past this may have been the case, back when the Catholic Church held a lot more sway than it does in Ireland. There are situations, I suppose, when someone who has been raped might be in prison for some other, maybe line to police, maybe, or something like that. But it's not the case that being a rape victim, simply is cause for imprisonment in those places. That being said, those countries, as well as others, are places where people who are victims of rape can be punished, just not legally, right? So they can be punished by their families, they can be punished by their communities, they can be punished in a number of different ways, just not explicitly legally, as far as I know. In Lebanon, women are only allowed to vote once they have proven that they are educated. Okay, this is no longer the case. This was the case back in 1952. There was a law that was passed, the Women's Political Rights Agreement, that did allow women to vote in Lebanon, which was very progressive for the time. And it did require these women to be educated, but all that was required was an elementary school education. So it wasn't like they had to have college degrees or PhDs, or even high school diplomas. All they had to have was like a basic elementary education, and they were allowed to vote. And then 5 years later, this was repealed. So it's no longer the case that women have to even have an elementary school education in Lebanon to vote. At least 30 countries across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia practice female genital mutilation to inhibit sexual pleasure or otherwise control the female sexuality. This practice includes, but is not limited to, removal of the clitoris and or external genitalia. This is true. I don't know if the number is still accurate. I believe that there are increasingly limited accessibility for female genital mutilation. There are certainly still countries where this is maybe not common. It's still, even in the countries where it happens, my understanding is that it's associated really with sort of like the backwards areas. This isn't necessarily something that happens where people are educated. There's a really famous individual that you've probably heard about, but maybe not, just on the chance that you haven't. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, she was a Somalian refugee to the Netherlands. She ended up in the Netherlands, claimed refugee status there. Her family were trying to force her to marry someone that she didn't want to marry, and so she escaped as a refugee. She became a member of Dutch Parliament and wrote a number of books, including the book Infidel, which is a memoir of her time growing up in Somalia and escaping to the Netherlands. And it does include her story about when she had female genital mutilation done to her. And it was done by her grandmother. And I believe this practice is typically something that older women do to younger women, young girls, before the age of puberty. And it is something that I really do not honestly understand. I mean, I understand that it's a way of controlling their sexuality. It is not explicitly a religious practice. It is not something that comes out of Islam per se. It's not something that comes out of Christianity per se, although it is more common, I think, in Islamic influenced cultures than Christian. It certainly was the case in Africa, where Ayaan Hirsi Ali lived. She was from Muslim Somalia. They moved for a time to Kenya, where there were more Christians, and the Christian girls had not had this practice done to them. And she and her Somalian family and friends looked down on the Kenyan girls for having not gone through that. There's something wrong with them. When unfortunately the opposite was true. So if you're interested in learning more about that experience and Ayaan Hirsi Ali in general, I think she's a really interesting person. Check out her book Infidel, which covers that aspect of her life.
One of the most famous passages in the Bible is paraphrased as follows. A group of Jewish leaders dragged an adulteress to Jesus and insisted he make a judgment regarding her crime. They thought they had caught Jesus in a dilemma of sorts. On the one hand, if Jesus upheld the Old Testament punishment of death for adultery by stoning, Leviticus 20:10, they could accuse him of not being the man of peace he proclaimed to be. On the other hand, if Jesus recommended that she be spared, they could accuse him of being a false teacher and a hypocrite, Matthew 5:18. Ultimately, Jesus stated, "He who is without sin, cast the first stone." He then told the woman to go and sin no more. The problem is, this entire story, John 7:53 through 8:11, is not present in the oldest and best copies of the Gospel of John. Greek manuscripts P66 and P75 from 200 CE, no adulteress. Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanicus from 300 CE, no adulteress. It is not until the copy of John in Codex Bezae, circa 500 CE, that we find the famed tale. Another example. If you belong to a denomination that practices speaking in tongues or handling venomous reptiles, you have fallen for the authority of a forged document. Speaking in tongues, Mark 16:17, and handling snakes, Mark 16:18, wasn't added to the original Gospel of Mark for at least a century. Now ask yourself, how many more significant biblical stories are just counterfeit afterthoughts?
It's the Nuwaubian Nation of Moors, started in New York in 1967 by Dwight York, who called himself Malachi Z. York, maybe because Malcolm X was already taken, but he started a bunch of black Muslim groups and preached black supremacy mixed with some Egyptian, which he spelled with an I, not a Y, and UFO pyramid type stuff, Illuminati, Bilderbergers, no theology, he said factology. And it's such a typical cult. I mean, he took advantage of all the members. He built a mansion in the Catskills in New York and preached that all whites are devils and always will be because of leprosy and mating with jackals and dogs, and that Christianity was a tool to keep pale man in power, which, yes, it has been used that way. I don't blame him, and I don't blame black people for being taken in by this. So he said that as a tool to keep pale man in power, to destroy the heritage of Nubian black men and women and children. He mixed a lot of his beliefs, by audience, kind of reading the audience in that, and opened quite a few chapters, even some in a couple other countries like Trinidad. They had some restaurants, begged, did a lot of pamphlets. He added UFOs and Atlantis. I think maybe similar to the Wakanda Black Panther story. The comic books were out then. I don't know, maybe he read that. But he moved from the Catskills in 1993, bought 476 acres in Putnam, Georgia, where he built a compound, had them build him a pyramid, and changed his name to Chief Black Eagle of the Yamasee Native American Moors of the Creek Nation, to try and open a casino in that pyramid. And when that attempt failed, he opened a nightclub in it. Oh, the other place in the Catskills was called Camp Jazeer. And the whole time he was using his adherents, his believers, and taking all their assets and beating them if they didn't bring in a certain quota, and preaching all this stuff, and also using their children as sex slaves, especially their little girls, their young girls. I only found one thing about a 6-year-old. One of the witnesses said from the time she was 6, most of them were about 12, 13 when he started with them. But his wives, his main wife especially, would groom them, teach them what they needed to know. But he had a son, Jacob York, who left the cult in 1990. And when he heard about this pyramid called Tamaray, the thing was, in Georgia, there in Putnam, Georgia, when the police shut down the nightclub due to zoning, it was illegal there. He started putting out papers. This was near Eatonton, Georgia. That was the biggest city right there. He had a magazine called All Eyes on Egypt. And he called any black leaders in Georgia House N-word, and was kind of terrorizing the county attorney, Frank Ford. Left a gutted dog on his property, threw bricks through the windows, and not him personally necessarily, but his followers. And they also threatened Sheriff Sills. And Dwight's son, Jacob, went to confront his father in 1968 because he heard about Tamaray. Oh, he heard about Tamaray because in 1993, Jesse Jackson Al Sharpton spoke. I think that was in 98, and then Jesse Jackson in 2001. But Dwight's son, Jacob, he went to confront his father in 1998 when he heard about Tama Ray, because they were putting out to the public that they were being discriminated against by Georgia, by Putnam County, but mostly by Eatonton. And yet they were doing all this terrorist activity there. And Dwight told his son Jacob, I don't believe any of this shit. I'd dress up as a nun or be a Jew for this kind of money. But the ATF and the FBI got in on it, and they wanted to really be careful and not have another Waco incident. But they did arrest Dwight York because Jacob York worked with Sheriff Sills and found hundreds of victims. They had 90 victims, I guess, that they actually charged, and 70-some witnesses. And in 2004, Dwight got 135 years in prison, and his main wife got a couple of years. What my take on this, though, is why does this kind of proves a lack of God also. All this stuff that this guy did for years, and yet here's this young man, also in 1960s. He was assassinated by the government in 1969 in Chicago in his bed at age 21. And he was just as charismatic, and he wanted to do all colors, a rainbow coalition. He was preaching peace, but getting equality in that. And yet, he's murdered. And look at all the black people killed. That, it's always been going on, but we just see it now with all the cameras and that. And to me, that just shows, there is no God watching out for the good, because, I know believers will say it was Satan, but no, it was just one guy covered it up, and was more public with it. And that times had changed by the 90s and the 2000s when he got arrested. So as far as, they didn't just gun him down because of Waco and that happening. To me, that's just another nail in the coffin of the Bible.
Jesus was probably a stonecutter, not a carpenter. The ancient Greek word uses the New Testament as is tekton, which means craftsman in the time of Jesus. Tekton was primarily used to describe a stonecutter or mason. We as black people, dark-skinned people, have struggled for a very long time, myself included, and want to be equal like everyone else, but it never seems to be the case. It has always been a struggle, and I feel like it's going to continue to be a struggle until we remove the toxicity from the world, meaning getting rid of some of this toxic, some of this toxic language. Actually educating people on on what's really going on, not just on past stuff, but our present stuff. If you want people to be progressive and successful, have a really good understanding of the way of the world, teach them a little bit about the past, and then teach them about our present. And at that point, they can make a decision. It's like, okay, are we actively changing, or are we actively just moving around, hoping that something different's going to happen? Because there's definitely a big difference between progressing slowly and running around in a circle. Running around in a circle, oh, it looks like you got ahead. No, we didn't go back, or we didn't get that far ahead. Now we're, back in that same circle over and over and over and over. Whereas progressively moving forward is, oh, boom, yeah, we're going to do equal, yes, we're going to do equal rights. Yes, we're going to do, all these things. It's like, okay, well, you know what? Come talk to me when there is truly equal rights, meaning It doesn't matter if you're gay, black. Actually, you know what? Yeah, come talk to me when being black, being a black trans, being a black gay person, being a black bisexual isn't looked down upon. Because all we're doing nowadays is just putting band-aids on these situations. One of the most beautiful things I think I've seen this year in 2020 was everyone standing up during a pandemic. And it's funny because I almost feel as if, the pandemic, they were hoping that the pandemic would suppress us. And in a sense, it didn't. We were smart, but we still stood for what was right. And in all honesty, shit like what I just read is just unacceptable. And honestly, if people take the time to educate themselves and maybe actually do something a little different, maybe even learn from a different person's perspective, different race perspective, that we can actually move forward, we can actually have equality.